Well, hi, this is Dr. Pete, and I have a new video for you regarding the AMPK-mTOR method. And specifically, it addresses the question regarding protein intake on AMPK days, mTOR days, and rest days. And we want to keep the signal clear on AMPK and mTOR days, but what do we do about rest days, and what about signal dominance? Is that a factor here? Turns out that it is, and we need to understand that little nuance in order to apply the method most properly, especially as we get older, right? And that way we can ensure the best likelihood of adaptations that we seek. In other words, building muscular strength and power, and also cardiovascular endurance. So stick with me. Here we go. So let's start off our discussion with this key question. Can the way in which we consume protein when we try to follow the AMPK-mTOR method of training, meaning the daily amounts of protein that we would consume, actually blunt the AMPK and mTOR signals? Specifically, what I'm getting at is if we consume a high amount of protein on an AMPK day, either by mistake or intentionally, will that interfere with the AMPK signal that we are trying to optimize? Well, in order to answer, let's back up a bit and remind ourselves about the method. We are alternating AMPK and mTOR days in our training, but it's not just about our exercise patterns, it's also our dietary patterns that differ on those days. So when we use the method, protein, especially the amino acid leucine, will activate mTOR. But we want a clear AMPK signal on AMPK days, not a blurred or mixed one that also activates mTOR. AMPK days are designed, after all, to emphasize metabolic and energy-related signaling. So the concern is this: if we eat a substantial amount of protein on an AMPK day, are we interfering with the AMPK signal? Are we unintentionally turning then that day into an mTOR day instead? That's the question that we need to answer clearly now, and the answer actually requires a slightly deeper understanding of how these systems actually work than what I have provided so far in my other videos. So our slide title here, Protein Does Not Define the Day, and we will explain that. Let's recall, though, that in terms of exercise, an AMPK day is focused on cardio training and light endurance work, not heavy weight training. When coupled to a lower caloric intake, perhaps to a partial fast during the day, the result will be an AMPK signal being generated that facilitates several beneficial adaptations, including improved cardiovascular health, mitochondrial biogenesis, insulin sensitivity, fat-burning metabolism and energy efficiency, and cellular cleanup, a process termed autophagy. On the other hand, an mTOR day is intentionally different in terms of both the diet and the exercise. On mTOR days, the goal is to engage in strength training, which provides the key stimulus of mechanical tension to the neuromuscular system. The diet requires a boost in calories compared to an AMPK day, as well as a boost in protein. And we're talking about high-quality protein rich in the amino acid leucine. This is because that molecule is the kickstarter for muscle protein synthesis and helps us grow larger muscle tissue and become stronger. And when coupled to a strength training exercise day, we've got literally a 1-2 punch: protein plus strength training. Now, a large body of research evidence has documented that protein can aid in mTOR activation in conjunction with resistance training, but this activation is brief, localized, and relatively small compared to the signal created by the training. So while protein creates a short pulse of mTOR activity, it does not define the overall physiological state, anabolic state, of the day. We should not think that the body operates in rigid on or off switches. Instead, it operates in patterns, rhythms, and dominant signals. Protein is certainly critical, but it does not create the same systemic, full-bodied anabolic environment that resistance training does. Just try to build muscle on protein alone without any strength training. So, based upon what we just said, and we will revisit this in a later slide, if a person were to eat the same amount of protein on an AMPK day as they did on an mTOR day, there really would not be much of a problem because, as was pointed out here, protein's effect would be small compared to the training effect on mTOR activation. So let's keep this in mind when we consider whether eating a lot of protein on an AMPK day or even a rest day would or would not create a significant problem in what ends up being the dominant signal for a particular day. Well, I don't know if you caught it, but I briefly mentioned signal dominance a moment ago, so now is the perfect time to explain that concept. It has to do with answering the question, which signal, AMPK or mTOR, leads the day on any particular day? And the first point is this. Instead of asking whether a day is purely AMPK or purely mTOR, the better question is this: which signal is dominant? We should realize that on an AMPK day, the dominant metabolic environment in the body is shaped by energy demand, lower insulin levels, and metabolic stress. Activities such as fasting, aerobic work, meaning training, and reduced calorie intake support this. And even if a good amount of protein is consumed on such a day, the overall environment that is created by the training and the caloric stress and so forth will still favor AMPK activity. And said another way, the system remains metabolically focused, not growth focused, which would be mTOR. So allow me to explain a little bit further. In the AMPK-mTOR method, it is important to understand that while protein certainly does play a role in activating mTOR, protein is not the primary driver of the anabolic state. Strength training is. The mechanical tension and loading from resistance exercise will create the dominant signal that tells the body to build and repair muscle. Protein then supports that process by providing the necessary building material. This is why consuming adequate protein on an AMPK day or on a rest day will not turn them into mTOR days. The signal remains metabolic or recovery focused because on an AMPK day, the training stimulus from cardio and endurance type training is different. And this concept of signal dominance turns out to be the key and the nuance that we're trying to explain on this video. So at the same time, muscle is not built during the workout itself, as you probably know, but in the hours and days that follow the workout. This means that the period of time between strength training sessions is when much of the actual rebuilding of muscle tissue and growth occurs. And this process depends on having sufficient protein available, of course. And for this reason, the typical weekly structure that I will lay out now, such as having mTOR days on Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, and AMPK days on Tuesday and Friday, and rest days on Wednesday and Sunday, it makes sense to keep protein intake relatively consistent across that entire week. And by doing so, you ensure that the body is always supported for repair and adaptation without concern that you are overriding the intended signal of the day. So I may have gotten ahead of myself by saying what I just did at the end of the last slide, but that's okay. I will be brief this time. The point was that protein plays a supportive role. It provides the building material needed for repair and adaptation, especially following a prior mTOR strength training day. And we all know that muscle protein synthesis does not stop when the workout ends. It continues for 24 to 48 hours, and in older adults, sometimes longer. So when you consume protein on a rest day or an AMPK day, that will not ruin the AMPK-mTOR method at all. You are not initiating a new growth phase. You are simply supporting a process that is already underway. So, in case you missed it, we are emphasizing what truly drives muscle growth via mTOR activation, and we're saying that the strongest activator of mTOR is not protein alone. It is mechanical tension, it is load, it is resistance training, picking up and moving weights, pushing, pulling against weight. Protein's role is to enhance that signal, which it does very well, but it does not replace it. Without training sessions, protein creates only a mild and temporary anabolic effect. It cannot produce the same level of adaptation or growth signaling as a resistance or strength training workout. The strongest activator of mTOR is mechanical tension. We are talking about it here, resistance training, strength training. That is what creates a meaningful anabolic signal. Protein plays a key supporting role that no other nutrient can replace or provide, but without the training, it produces only a mild and temporary effect. The real concern on an AMPK day is not protein intake. We are trying to make this point abundantly clear. The real concern is the overall environment. And when we talk about environment, we're talking about the total state of the body, how much energy is coming in, how much is being used, what hormones are doing, and how active you are, things like that. And this combination determines whether AMPK or mTOR becomes dominant. So on an AMPK day, as long as energy demand is present, as long as insulin is controlled, and as long as movement is maintained at the right level, the environment will support AMPK, even if protein intake is fairly robust. However, if the day includes excess calories, high carbohydrate intake, and low endurance type activity, or none, then AMPK signaling is weakened. But energy demand, if it's present due to proper endurance activity, cardio workouts, and so forth, if insulin is controlled by a proper lower carb diet, and if calories are not abundant, then AMPK remains the dominant signal even if there is robust protein intake. You can have moderate protein intake on an AMPK day, or you can have more than moderate. You can have robust. In either case, the real concern on an AMPK day is not protein intake. It is the overall environment that you are creating through movement and your activity, as well as your eating pattern. So let me go one step further here in terms of trying to get the point across regarding protein intake on AMPK days and even on rest days. So the point I'm trying to make now is that, as most people know, if you are strength training, you're going to need rest in between strength training sessions or strength training days. So let's say that you have strength training 2 or 3 times a week. You're going to have rest days in between them. Now, we've modified our approach by introducing the concept of the AMPK-mTOR method. So that simply means that we now equate strength training days to mTOR days. And then the days in between can either be AMPK days or rest days. And in either case, what we're now saying, we're refining our method slightly, fine-tuning it, to indicate that absolutely protein is essential on those in-between days, because even before we were thinking about AMPK or mTOR, we knew that the body was going to rebuild and adapt during the rest day especially. And the growth, the hypertrophy of muscle does not take place as you're working out. It takes place hours and up to a couple of days after. So protein needs to support that. So it makes complete sense that we don't want to restrict protein on AMPK days or on rest days. Now, if you do take in a lesser amount of protein on an AMPK day, it's not terrible. But since we are rebuilding our muscle tissue on those days, it makes sense to have adequate protein. So now, perhaps, with these points that have been made in this presentation, we are achieving a more complete understanding of how protein plays into the total picture of our weekly life of training and recovery and rest. AMPK days, mTOR days, and rest days. We are recognizing not on and off switches as much as we should be recognizing metabolic signals. We do not turn mTOR and AMPK on and off like light switches. That's a good way to first understand the system, but as we dig deeper and try to gain increasing understanding, we want to understand that we are creating dominant biological signal versions of mTOR and AMPK rather than a light switch. On mTOR days, we push growth through training and proper nutrition. On AMPK days, we support metabolic health while allowing recovery and repair to continue. Protein creates brief mTOR-needed pulses across the week. Training and energy status create the proper environment to work with these protein pulses. And fortunately, the primary drivers are food energy, intentionally scarce or abundant, our activity and exercise type, endurance versus resistance training, and then essentially a supporting role for protein across the board. So to repeat, on mTOR days, we push growth through training and nutrition. On AMPK days, we emphasize metabolic health while allowing recovery to continue. Protein creates brief pulses, but the environment determines which signals lead, which signals are dominant on which day. So we're looking here at practical application, keeping protein consistent. And as it says, we need to maintain our protein daily intake, avoiding large reductions of protein on AMPK days and rest days. This will protect muscle and our recovery. What recovery? Well, recovery from working out, certainly, but if we get an injury, recovery from injury, especially critical for us as we age. So protein should remain consistent across all 7 days of the week, especially, as we say, in older adults. If we reduce protein too much on those days, we can impair recovery, accelerate muscle loss, and weaken our long-term strength. So the goal here is not to eliminate mTOR entirely on these days. The goal is to shift the dominant signal while preserving muscle and function. So dominant signal on AMPK days is going to remain AMPK, and the dominant signal on mTOR days is going to remain mTOR. Okay, on this slide, we have a small chart that compares body weight to daily protein target. So we have an individual with a weight of 175 pounds, and their daily protein target is calculated to be 125 to 160 grams total protein intake for a day. And this is an mTOR day, by the way. Now, someone who's heavier, 200 pounds, their protein target intake increases accordingly to 145 to 180 grams of protein per day is the range on an mTOR day. And then we have a heavier individual still at 225 pounds, and their target protein intake per day on an mTOR day is 160 to 205 grams of protein. So another key point is that muscle is not built during the workout itself, but in the hours and days that follow, and we've made this point already. So muscle protein synthesis remains elevated, however, well after you get done with your strength training session on an mTOR day, which means that the body is actively rebuilding and remodeling during what we typically think of as a rest day that follows an mTOR day, or an AMPK day that follows an mTOR day. And for that reason, protein intake should remain consistently elevated and sufficient across the entire week, not just on training days. If protein is underconsumed on rest or AMPK days, the body will lack the necessary building blocks to complete the adaptation that the workout initiated. And in this sense, rest days and AMPK days are not nutritionally off days with respect to protein. They are active rebuilding days. This slide should really hit home. It shows the protein content of some common foods. As we try to reach our target daily amounts, just think about that. 2 eggs, 12 grams, 8 ounces glass of milk, 8 grams. That's not very much if we need to take in 150 or more grams of protein in a day. And you see how it progresses. Protein shake, 8-ounce steak, 30 and 50 grams, rotisserie chicken, double cheeseburger, canned tuna fish, salmon, filet, sausage and brisket, barbecue plate. Now, the reason we're looking at this is to show a variety of food protein sources. Yes, admittedly, some of them are healthier options than others, but when people begin aiming for 150 to 200 grams of protein per day, one of the first realizations is just how substantial that amount really is and how difficult it is to achieve without planning. For example, even a solid, nutrient-dense choice like an 8-ounce salmon fillet provides only about 50 grams of protein, which is only a third to a quarter of a person's requirement, meaning it takes multiple intentional servings throughout the day to reach the target. And what this quickly should reveal to each one of us is that most of us are not simply a little low on protein. We are often consuming barely half of what is needed to effectively support muscle maintenance and growth as we age. And reaching these higher protein intake levels does not happen by accident or through small adjustments. It requires deliberate planning and a conscious effort to prioritize protein at every meal. And in that sense, adequate protein intake becomes less about occasional choices and more about planning and a consistent daily strategy, one that, when followed, places a person in a much stronger position to preserve their muscle, maintain function, and support long-term health. Now, what about dairy foods? A lot of people enjoy dairy foods. And when we look at three common dairy foods like Greek yogurt, ricotta cheese, and 2% cottage cheese, they all provide high-quality protein, but the actual amounts and their ability to stimulate muscle protein synthesis differ. A typical 1-cup serving of Greek yogurt provides about 22 to 25 grams of protein and roughly 1.8 to 2.3 grams of leucine, while cottage cheese is slightly higher at about 25 to 28 grams of protein and 2.0 to 2.6 grams of leucine. Ricotta cheese, on the other hand, is lower in protein density, providing about 17 to 20 grams of protein and approximately 1.4 to 1.8 grams of leucine per cup. These differences do matter because leucine plays a key role in triggering muscle protein synthesis, and not all protein sources, as we see here, deliver enough of it in typical serving sizes. What is meant by enough leucine? Well, this is something that I discuss in detail in my Hard to Kill book. And for older adults, the leucine threshold to effectively stimulate MPS is generally in the range of about 2.5 to 3 grams per meal. So when viewed through this lens, even a full cup of these foods may fall short or only just begin to approach that threshold. Of course, you could eat a little more than a cup and make it. But cottage cheese, if we compare them, comes closest. Greek yogurt is often right on the border. And ricotta typically requires additional protein alongside of it. One thing that I've done is I've mixed all three of these products together, and that's a delicious option. The practical takeaway is that it is not enough to simply include protein-rich foods in your diet. You have to know the total protein dose per meal so that it is sufficient to drive the desired physiological response. In other words, dairy proteins are excellent in quality, but quantity also matters, as we see here, and it is what determines whether the body is going to receive a strong enough signal to support muscle maintenance and growth. Now, this next slide is interesting because it compares for those three different body weights, 175 pounds, 200 pounds, and 225 pounds, compares the protein requirement or suggested daily protein intake anyway, according to the day, whether it's an mTOR day, an AMPK day, or a rest day. So if you look at the top part of this figure, you can see how the body weight affects protein intake in general terms. The more heavy the individual is, the greater their protein intake, therefore, to support their muscle protein synthesis. And what's catching my eye especially is the fact that the mTOR days have the highest protein requirement, and that's not surprising because of the spike in mTOR signaling that we're trying to achieve there, mainly through the workout, the strength training workout, but also through protein intake, whereas AMPK and rest days are pretty close to the mTOR day in terms of the amount of protein that is suggested. I guess I shouldn't really use the word required. Suggested is a better term here. But again, the key is that we are consistently aiming for a pretty substantial protein intake target across all the days of the week, whether it's mTOR, AMPK, or rest day. And I also wanted to point out that these ranges, it says at the bottom of the slide, are based upon 1.6 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And that is based on what you find in the research literature. It can even go higher, up to 2.2 grams per day, but I opted for this particular range as being reasonable. And the other bit of information is in the center of this slide, and it does a nice job of breaking down all 7 days of the week for us and assigning to each day whether it's going to be an mTOR day, an AMPK day, or a rest day. So you see, in this particular example of a 7-day week, we have 1, 2, 3 mTOR days, 1, 2 AMPK days, and 1, 2 rest days for a total of 7 days. And that's actually a very good formula for using the AMPK-mTOR method during a week of 7 days. And now we not only know that framework, but we also know the framework requirement, or I should say suggestion again, for protein intake based upon your body weight. Now, if you happen to be lighter than what we have here, say you're 150 pounds, then you would just have to decrease your intake accordingly. And if you're heavier than 225 pounds, you'd have to increase your intake by a percentage. Now, even though we can see slight differences in the numbers for protein intake, depending on whether it's an mTOR day or an AMPK or rest day. When we look at these practical recommendations, the differences in protein intake between these three different kinds of days are actually quite small. You see that. And there's significant overlap here, which leads to an important and I think helpful conclusion. For many individuals, especially aging adults, it is both effective and easier to maintain a consistent daily protein intake rather than trying to adjust it precisely day by day. A steady intake is what I'm saying in the range of approximately 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day is sufficient to support muscle growth, preservation of muscle, and recovery across all day types. So ultimately, the distinction between days in the AMPK-mTOR method is driven by training, not by protein. Protein supports the process, but it does not define the signal. And I'm really making this one point repeatedly in the video. Keeping protein intake consistent day by day will not turn an AMPK day or a rest day into an mTOR day. Instead, it ensures that the body is always prepared to respond appropriately to the training stimulus from your workout, whether that stimulus is growth, in the case of strength training workouts, or metabolic efficiency, in the case of cardio workouts, or recovery. And in practice, this simplifies the approach while still preserving its effectiveness. A simple way to summarize is this. The signal changes from day to day, but the body's need for protein does not, and we can have it both ways. By keeping intake consistently adequate, and I'm talking protein, you can support the full cycle of adaptation, performance on training days, preservation on metabolic days, and rebuilding on rest days. You don't need to change protein every day. Just make sure it's consistently high enough to support your muscle and your muscle recovery. So, finishing up on this final insight, so to speak, we realize that protein does not ruin an AMPK day. It supports the body while a different signal is leading. And in that case, AMPK being the lead signal, this is important because it drives longevity, AMPK signal. So we're not canceling metabolic benefits at all by having protein on AMPK day. We're preserving the system while it adapts. And that balance between growth and maintenance is what supports long-term strength, resilience, longevity, as we said already, and our independence. So here we are at the finish line, and it has been my hope that through the presentation I provided additional clarity regarding and applying and implementing the AMPK-mTOR method as your weekly training and recovery cycles. I don't want anyone to stress out over the protein issue either. Just be sure to try your best at consuming adequate protein, and I know it's not easy, it requires planning. But we do this because the body is in need of it, no matter if it's an AMPK day, a rest day, or certainly an mTOR day. So be sure to do your best to get adequate protein into your diet that is high quality. You can refer to the chart in this presentation to remind yourself about where protein is found and in what amounts in certain foods. And this would equate to between 30 and 50 grams of protein per meal. People ask, well, how much does that break down into each meal? There's the answer, 30 to 50 grams per meal, depending on if you plan to consume, let's say, 3 50-gram meals or 4 30-gram meals or something like that. So have fun with your workouts, apply the method, and enjoy the results, even in advanced age. And in the end, we are not choosing between metabolism and muscle. We are learning how to give both of them a chance to flourish intentionally. I'll summarize this way. In the AMPK-mTOR method, protein intake is not turned on or off. It is instead strategically adjusted based upon the dominant signal of the day while remaining consistently sufficient across the week. On mTOR days, when the goal is to build, repair, and strengthen through resistance training, protein intake is intentionally higher to support muscle protein synthesis and fully capitalize on the growth signal that is provided through the training. On AMPK days, the focus shifts toward metabolic efficiency, but protein is not reduced to low levels at all. Instead, it remains moderate or fully sufficient to preserve muscle and support ongoing repair without aggressively pushing growth pathways. And on rest days, protein becomes especially important because this is when much of the actual rebuilding occurs. Intake, therefore, should remain moderate to moderately high to ensure recovery processes are fully supported. And in fact, since the difference between the protein intake on mTOR, AMPK, and rest days is really not that significantly different, we might as well just aim for the same amount each day of the week. And in this way, protein is not just tied to the workout itself or a particular day, but the entire cycle of adaptation that happens all week long, supporting performance on training days, preservation on metabolic days, and rebuilding on rest and recovery days. So today was an mTOR day for me, and I'm going to make sure that I consume enough protein, especially after this video, taking the information and applying it. So I wanted to invite you to check out other videos that I've put together for you in this series, and they are available on my website or on my YouTube channel or even on Facebook. So Dr. Pete here saying until next time, I'm wishing you all the best. Bye-bye.